Somewhere in Shenzhen this spring, a car rolled off an assembly line carrying a battery that charges faster than you can fill a tank of gas, shrugs off temperatures that would cripple a Tesla, and comes in a car priced under $16,000. This isn't a concept car. It isn't a promise dated 2030. It's already on the road, already charging in the time it takes to use a gas station bathroom. And the one argument gasoline has clung to for 15 years, the one thing EVs supposedly couldn't do, just quietly stopped being true. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what BYD built, why it breaks a rule of battery engineering that was supposed to be unbreakable, why American automakers have gone completely silent on it, and where the one real catch is. Because there is one, and it's not where you'd expect. Here's what's strange. When a rival drops a real threat, American automakers usually respond fast. A counter-announcement, a leaked roadmap, an executive on a podcast explaining why their approach is actually better. This time, nothing. No comeback, no counter numbers, no timeline of their own. Just silence. To understand why the silence is so damning, you have to understand exactly what just got taken off the table. For 15 years, two objections have kept otherwise interested buyers out of an EV showroom. First, charging takes too long. Even today's best fast chargers need 20 to 40 minutes for a meaningful top-up. That's not a coffee break. That's most of a movie's runtime, standing in a parking lot. Second, cold weather wrecks them. Drop the temperature toward freezing, and battery chemistry slows to a crawl. Range collapses. Charging times can double. Ask anyone who's owned an EV through a real winter. They'll tell you the marketing brochure and the January morning are two different cars. In China, there's a saying for this exact problem. EVs can't cross the Shanghai Pass, the mountain gateway separating the mild south from the brutal winters of the north. If you lived in Harbin, where winter nights hit -30 degrees Celsius, an EV wasn't a serious option. It was a bet against your own driveway. Every automaker on Earth has known about both of these problems for over a decade. Nobody solved them at the same time. Until now. March 5, 2026. Shenzhen. BYD chairman Wang Chuanfu stands on stage and unveils two things in the same breath: the second-generation Blade battery, and a charging system called flash charging. The numbers he puts on the screen: 10% to 70% charge in 5 minutes, 10% to 97% in 9 minutes. At -30 degrees Celsius, the penalty is 3 extra minutes. Total. BYD's slogan for it says everything in 6 words: ready in 5, full in 9, cold add 3. This isn't a lab curiosity behind velvet rope. It's already equipped in the Denza Z9 GT, BYD's flagship sedan, launching across Europe in April 2026, with over 1,000 kilometers of range on a single charge. Read that again. A car that goes further than almost anything on the road today, charges faster than you can finish a sandwich, and barely notices when the temperature falls off a cliff. To understand why almost nobody thought this was possible, you need to understand a rule battery engineers have lived by for 30 years. A rule BYD just broke in public. Every battery ever built is a negotiation between 3 things: how fast it charges, how much energy it holds, and how safe it is when something goes wrong. Engineers have a name for this. They call it the impossible triangle. Push a battery to charge faster, and it usually gets more dangerous. More heat, more stress on the cell walls. Make it hold more energy, and it usually charges slower. Make it bulletproof safe, and you usually sacrifice range to get there. Pick 2. That was the rule. To see why that rule existed in the first place, you have to go back to where the modern battery era actually started. And it didn't start with safety. It started with a fire. In 1991, a Japanese company called Sony released the first commercial lithium-ion battery, and it changed the physical size of the modern world. Devices that used to be bricks became pocketable. Laptops that barely survived a single meeting became all-day machines. The battery in your phone right now traces its lineage directly back to that release. But lithium-ion had a flaw baked into its chemistry from day one, and for 25 years the industry mostly managed it rather than fixed it. The liquid that moves energy between the two ends of a lithium cell is flammable, genuinely combustible, under the wrong conditions: overheating, a puncture, a badly managed charge cycle. In 2016, the world found out exactly what that flaw looked like at scale. Samsung released the Galaxy Note 7. Reviewed as the best phone the company had ever made, pre-orders sold out within days. Within weeks, phones were catching fire in pockets, on nightstands, mid-flight on commercial aircraft. Every airline on Earth banned it. Every unit got recalled. The final bill to Samsung: $5 billion, one of the most expensive product failures in consumer electronics history. The uncomfortable truth buried in that story is that the Note 7 wasn't uniquely flawed. The risk it exposed was sitting inside every lithium-ion cell ever made. High energy density and fast charging pushed hard enough, and eventually something gives. That's the trade-off the impossible triangle describes. It's why, for 3 decades, fast and energy-dense quietly meant handle with extreme care. BYD's own early battery bet was actually a reaction to exactly this problem. Years before this announcement, BYD deliberately chose a lower energy density chemistry, lithium iron phosphate, the basis for their original Blade battery, specifically because it was dramatically harder to set on fire. Rivals using higher density nickel-based chemistries mocked the choice as a step backward. BYD's Blade battery went on to pass a test most cells fail spectacularly. A steel nail driven straight through the pack, with no fire and barely a temperature rise. Everyone assumed that safety came at a permanent cost to speed and range. BYD spent the years since trying to prove that assumption wrong. Generation 2 is the result. BYD says the breakthrough took 6 years and came down to 3 engineering changes working together, in a system they're calling the FlashPass ion transport structure. First, a redesigned cathode with particles engineered to release lithium ions faster in a specific direction, instead of scattering the reaction randomly. Second, an electrolyte reformulated with the help of AI modeling to conduct ions more efficiently. Third, an anode built to accept lithium ions from all sides at once, rather than funneling them through a narrow entry point. Put together, BYD claims internal resistance drops sharply, heat generation falls at the source rather than being managed after the fact, and, this is the number that should have engineers doing a double take. Energy density actually went up 5% over Generation 1, at the same time charging speed multiplied several times over. That's the equivalent of an engineer telling you they made a car's fuel tank bigger, its engine more powerful, and its top speed higher, all in the same redesign, without adding weight. Normally you don't get all 3. BYD is claiming they did. A fair caveat here. These are BYD's own published figures. Independent third-party validation of long-term degradation and failure rates at real-world scale, the kind of data that only shows up after a couple of years of fleets driving through actual winters, isn't public yet. Keep that in the back of your mind for the rest of this video, because it matters for what comes later. Here's the part of this story that I think is the real headline, buried under the flashier 5-minute charge number. In freezing conditions, most EVs lose half their charging speed or more. Some effectively refuse to fast charge below a certain temperature at all, forcing the car to trickle charge itself for safety. BYD's system, at -30 degrees Celsius, adds 3 minutes, from 20% to 97% in 12 minutes. In cold, that would leave most competing EVs limping. If that number holds up outside of BYD's own test conditions, it doesn't just make life easier for existing EV owners in northern China. It reopens an entire market segment that quietly wrote off EVs a decade ago. Canada, Scandinavia, Russia, the northern United States. Places where does it work in winter has always been the first question, not the last one. A battery this fast is useless if there's nowhere to plug it in that can actually deliver that kind of power. And this is where BYD did something almost nobody expected a car company to attempt at this scale. BYD isn't waiting for someone else to build the charging network. They're building it themselves. 20,000 flash-capable stations planned across China by the end of 2026. By April 1st, just 27 days after the stage announcement, 5,000 of those stations were already live across 297 cities. That's roughly 200 stations installed every single day. 2,000 of them are being placed specifically on highways, spaced roughly every 100 kilometers. A deliberate targeting of the exact scenario that creates range anxiety in the first place, the long drive between cities. The charger hardware itself isn't an afterthought either. It's a T-shaped overhead unit with what BYD calls a zero-gravity cable system, engineered so the heavy cable essentially lifts itself into your hand instead of dragging on the ground. A small detail, but one that matters at -20 degrees when a frozen, waterlogged cable is the difference between a 5-minute stop and a miserable 20-minute one. This is the same strategic playbook Tesla ran over a decade ago. Control the car and the charger. Own the entire customer experience end-to-end. BYD is running it at a speed and scale Tesla never attempted, with the manufacturing muscle of a company that also happens to build its own batteries, its own semiconductors, and its own vehicles under one roof. This announcement lands very differently depending on which logo is on your building. NIO built its entire identity, and a significant chunk of its balance sheet, around battery swapping. A 3-minute stop to physically exchange your depleted pack for a charged one. It's a genuinely clever solution to slow charging, but it comes with a brutal cost. an expensive proprietary network of swap stations that only NIO owners can use. A 9-minute full charge on infrastructure that isn't proprietary and doesn't require standing on a robotic platform closes most of that convenience gap, without the capital expenditure. That's not a marginal threat to NIO's core pitch, that's a direct one. Western and legacy automakers face a different problem. For years, the working assumption inside those companies was that you optimize for one or two corners of the impossible triangle and accept the trade-off on the third, usually accepting slower charging in exchange for range and safety. BYD's bet was that the triangle itself was the thing worth attacking, not just picking a corner and defending it. And BYD had a structural advantage almost none of its rivals share. They designed the battery chemistry, the cell, the pack, and the vehicle all inside the same company. When you're not waiting on an outside battery supplier to catch up to your vehicle roadmap, you can iterate at a speed that looks, from the outside, almost unfair. Here's the number that turns this from an interesting engineering story into an actual industry problem. BYD is targeting entry-level models with this exact technology starting around 111,900 yuan, roughly $16,000. Not a halo car. Not a flagship reserved for enthusiasts with money to spend on bragging rights. An entry-level price, with sub-10-minute charging and over 1,000 kilometers of range, in a car that functions through a genuine winter. At $16,000, the last remaining argument for gasoline, that gas stations are simply everywhere, is the only card left on the table. And BYD is spending the rest of 2026 specifically trying to take that card away too. So why has nobody in Detroit, or Wolfsburg, or Tokyo said anything? The honest answer is more uncomfortable than most executives will say out loud in public. And it's not that they don't have a response, it's that they don't have one yet. And admitting that in public would be worse than saying nothing at all. None of the individual problems here were secret. Engineers have understood the trade-offs of the impossible triangle for decades. They knew fast charging generated dangerous heat. They knew cold weather physically slowed ion movement. None of that was hidden in a locked drawer somewhere. But when a technology is delivering good enough results and the margins keep flowing, entire industries develop a very human habit. They stop asking whether something fundamentally better is possible and start optimizing what they already have. Western automakers spent the last decade refining thermal management software, adding battery heaters, tuning charge curves, clever engineering, but all of it working around the chemistry, not through it. BYD spent that same decade betting that the chemistry itself could be rebuilt. That's the actual gap here. Not a secret, a choice, made differently, by companies with different incentives and, crucially, different levels of vertical control over the whole stack. Before you walk away from this thinking gasoline cars are finished by Christmas, 3 things are worth sitting with. 1. These are company-published figures. BYD hasn't released independent third-party data on long-term degradation or failure rates at real-world scale. That's completely normal this early in a product's life. It's also exactly the kind of gap that has embarrassed early battery claims before, lithium included. 2. 20,000 stations sounds enormous. And it is, but it's still a domestic Chinese rollout for now. Rural coverage, remote regions, and international markets outside a handful of announced launches will lag the headline number by years, not months. 3. And this is the one almost nobody says out loud. This technology is arriving in a market most Americans will not be able to buy into anytime soon. BYD vehicles currently face steep tariffs that have effectively locked them out of the US market, and the European Union has its own tariffs on Chinese-made EVs working through its trade policy. The Denza Z9 GT is launching in Europe specifically because Europe, for now, is a door that's still open. The US market largely is not. Not because the technology doesn't work, but because of a trade policy decision that has nothing to do with battery chemistry at all. That last point matters more than it sounds like. The fastest, cheapest, most cold-tolerant battery in the world doesn't help an American buyer if the car it's inside of can't legally reach an American driveway. So what actually matters here, once you strip away the hype? BYD just demonstrated that the 3 things battery engineers insisted you couldn't have together, speed, range, and safety, may not be a permanent trade-off after all. Whether every one of these exact numbers survives independent testing over the next few years is still an open question. But the direction is no longer in doubt. Fast charging that works in the cold has stopped being a problem BYD solves only for its home market. It's now the bar every other automaker on Earth gets measured against, whether they're ready for that comparison or not. And right now they're not ready. Not NIO, still leaning on a swap network that just got quietly outpaced. Not Tesla, whose entire charging network advantage just got matched by a company building stations 200 a day. Not the legacy automakers in Detroit and Wolfsburg, who spent a decade patching the chemistry instead of rebuilding it. Every one of them has had months to say something. None of them have. That silence is the real story here. Not the 5-minute charge, not the cold weather number, the silence. Because the only thing more telling than a competitor announcing a breakthrough is a room full of rivals with absolutely nothing to say back. If a car like this were legally available in your driveway tomorrow, at that price, would tariffs and trade policy be the only thing left stopping you from buying one? Tell me in the comments, and tell me which automaker you think breaks the silence first.